The flood had already swallowed every clean, plowed field in Miller Valley. But when it reached the field, everyone called a disgrace. The water stopped acting like a flood. It was April 17, 1993. 6:12 in the morning. The first siren went off along County Road 6, and by then, Miller Creek was no longer a creek. It had become something else entirely. A brown, roaring sheet of water, alive and angry, tearing through the low fields of Miller Valley. It carried everything it touched. Fence posts ripped from the earth, seed bags spinning in the current like drowned birds, broken branches clawing at the surface, and the black topsoil, the rich, living skin of the land, rolling away from fields men had spent generations trying to protect. 3 days of rain had fallen on southern Iowa. At first, the farmers called it good moisture. They looked at the sky and nodded. The earth needed it. Then the ditches filled. Then the culverts disappeared. Then the creek climbed over its banks, slow and certain, like a creature that had been waiting for this moment, and started moving across the valley like it owned the land. Because on that morning, it did. By sunrise, pickup trucks lined the shoulder of County Road 6. Old Fords and Chevys sat in the rain, their faded paint dull under the gray sky. Men in raincoats stood with their hands in their pockets, staring across the flooded bottom ground. Nobody talked much. There is a kind of silence that only comes when men who spend their lives controlling the land realize they control nothing at all. The sheriff was there. The county road crew was there. The grain elevator manager had driven out from town because mud was already pushing toward the drainage ditch behind his bins. And if that ditch went, so did his livelihood. But at the end of the road, past the bend where the old cottonwoods leaned over the creek like weary guardians, everyone was watching the Whitaker farm. Not because they thought it would survive, because they were sure it would be the first one to go. For 6 months, they had laughed at that place. 42 acres, a leaning mailbox, a tired barn with rust on the roof, rust that bled orange every time it rained, a dead tractor under a tarp that had frozen into the shape of surrender, and behind the house, a bottom field so thick with ryegrass, clover, switchgrass, and wildflowers that men at the feed store had stopped calling it a farm. They called it the weed patch. They called it a disgrace. They called it a shame, because that land had once belonged to Daniel Whitaker, and Daniel Whitaker had been a man they respected. Roy Pritchard, the richest farmer in Miller Valley, had said it loud enough for half the town to hear, and when Roy Pritchard spoke, people listened. That is the way it works in small towns. Money talks. Acres talk louder. That girl isn't farming, Roy had said, shaking his head. She's letting her daddy's land turn back into weeds. The girl was Ellie Whitaker. She was 13 years old. 13. An age when most children are still trying to understand who they are. But Ellie Whitaker already knew. She was her father's daughter, and that meant something. That morning, while grown men waited for her father's field to wash away, Ellie stood at the edge of the road in a yellow raincoat, 2 sizes too big. Her father's raincoat. She held a blue notebook against her chest with both hands. She was small under that raincoat. Small against that sky, small against the brown water spreading across the valley. But she did not run. Inside that notebook was a sentence her father had written years earlier in pencil. The graphite had faded. The words had not. Never break the roots before flood season. The men had laughed at the roots. They had laughed at the grass. They had laughed at the child who refused to plow. Roy Pritchard had laughed louder than anyone. And now, standing beside his pickup with rain dripping from the brim of his hat, Roy watched the flood rush straight toward Ellie Whitaker's so-called ruined field. For a moment, he smiled, because he thought this was the moment everyone would see he had been right. He thought the water would rip through the weeds. He thought the field would tear open. He thought Ellie Whitaker would finally learn what every man on County Road 6 believed they already knew. That land had to be broken before it could be useful. But when Miller Creek finally reached Ellie Whitaker's overgrown field, it did not tear through the ground the way everyone expected. It slowed. It spread. It sank. The same flood that had ripped open clean plowed fields began losing its force in the very place they had mocked. The ryegrass bent, but it did not vanish. The clover disappeared under the brown water, then held. The switchgrass stood in thick rows, catching the current, breaking it apart, forcing it down into the soil instead of letting it run wild across the valley. Roy Pritchard stopped smiling. One by one, the men along County Road 6 went quiet, because the disgrace was holding. The weed patch was saving the valley, and the 13-year-old girl they had laughed at was the only one who had listened to the land. This is not a story about a flood. This is a story about what happens when everyone thinks they know what strength looks like, and a 13-year-old girl with her father's notebook proves them wrong. The Whitaker farm sat 3 miles outside Harlan Junction, Iowa. A town so small that if you blinked while driving through, you would miss it. But the people there had long memories, and those memories could be kind or cruel depending on the weather and the harvest. The farm was not a big farm, 42 acres total, 20 acres of higher ground near the house, where the soil was thin but dependable, 22 acres of bottomland behind the barn, rich, dark, and dangerous. Because bottomland is always one hard rain away from becoming river. A small pasture. A machine shed with one sliding door that never closed right. It had been that way since Ellie was a baby, and Daniel had always said he would fix it next spring. Next spring never came, and an old red Farmall cub that had not run steady since the winter Ellie's father died. Daniel Whitaker had never been a rich farmer. He did not own a fleet of tractors. He did not have a grain cart with polished paint, or a truck with chrome wheels that caught the sunset like a mirror. He wore the same canvas coat for 15 years, patched at the elbows, frayed at the cuffs, and kept rainfall records in pencil, because he trusted paper more than computers. Computers crash, he used to say. Paper just gets old, and old things remember. But more than that, Daniel understood ground. Not in the way agronomists understand ground, with their degrees and their textbooks. He understood it the way a musician understands an instrument, not by studying it, but by listening to it. He understood how water moved across a slope, not just where it went, but why it went there. He understood where a field would cut open if the soil was left bare too early, the invisible wounds waiting to happen beneath the surface. He understood why a ditch dug straight downhill could become a wound, a scar that would bleed soil for years. Daniel used to walk the bottom field with Ellie when she was little. She would follow behind him, her small boots making prints beside his large ones, a kind of map of father and daughter written in mud. He would kneel in the dirt, and there was something almost prayerful in the way he did it. Pull up a clump of grass, and show her the roots holding the soil together. "See this?" he would say, his voice low and gentle. "Roots are stitches. They hold the land closed. You take them out too soon, and the ground bleeds when the water comes." Ellie did not understand all of it back then. She was too young. The world was still simple. She only remembered the way her father listened to a field before he touched it. He would stand at the edge of the bottom ground for long minutes, saying nothing, his head tilted slightly, as if the land were whispering something only he could hear. 2 years before the flood, Daniel Whitaker was killed in a machinery accident while repairing a neighbor's tractor. He had gone to help because that was who he was. A man who fixed things, a man who showed up. After that, the farm became too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, the kind of quiet that comes from absence. Ellie's mother, Martha, took work at the diner in town. She worked the late shift, came home smelling like coffee and fryer oil, her feet aching, her hands cracked from washing dishes. She still tried to keep the chickens fed, the bills paid, and the roof from leaking over the kitchen stove. She tried with everything she had, which was not much, but it was everything. Some nights, Ellie would wake up and see the kitchen light still on. Her mother sitting at the table, staring at a stack of envelopes, not opening them, just staring. Ellie did what she could. She fed the hens before school, their soft clucking the only sound in the cold morning air. She checked fences after school, walking the perimeter like her father had taught her, looking for breaks, for weakness, for anything that needed mending. She carried water buckets, stacked firewood, and learned to fix gate latches with baling wire, because there was never money to buy new ones. She was 13 years old, and she was trying to hold a farm together with her bare hands. But in Miller Valley, people did not see a young girl trying to hold a farm together. They saw a farm slipping. They saw a barn that needed paint, a tractor that would not start, a fence that leaned in places. And nothing made them talk more than the bottom field. The bottom field did not look like the other fields in Miller Valley. Roy Pritchard's ground across the road was black and clean every spring. Straight rows, deep tillage, bare soil waiting for corn, as smooth and dark as a freshly ironed shirt. His machines were new enough that people slowed down to look when he drove them through town. They gleamed, they roared, they looked like money. The Whitaker bottom field looked different. By March it was green. Not neat green. Not the kind of green that comes in rows, orderly and obedient. It was rough, uneven, and wild-looking. The kind of green that made men like Roy Pritchard uncomfortable, because it did not follow the rules. Rye grass stood knee-high in patches, swaying in the wind like a restless audience. Clover spread low across the ground, a carpet of small leaves, humble and persistent. Switchgrass grew thick along the creek, tall enough to hide a deer, tough enough to bend in a storm without breaking. Wildflowers came up near the fence line, not planted, just welcome, purple and white and yellow, scattered like confetti from a celebration no one else was attending. Willow saplings held the bank in two wet corners where the creek had bitten the soil years before. Daniel had planted them himself, knowing their roots would grow deep and stubborn. To men who judged farming from the road, it looked abandoned. But it was not abandoned. The rye had been planted by Daniel before he died, his last act on that field, though he did not know it at the time. The clover had been reseeded by Ellie, with seed she bought using egg money, quarters and dimes saved in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. The switchgrass strip had been marked in Daniel's notebook as buffer, do not cut before June. He had written those words in careful pencil, underlining do not twice. And under that messy green cover was soil that had not been broken open before the spring rains. Daniel had believed that the bottom field was not just cropland. It was the farm's shield. Miller Creek curved hard behind the Whitaker place, a horseshoe bend that looked peaceful in summer, but turned dangerous when the rains came. During heavy rain, water came off the upper farms, rushed down the slope, crossed the road ditch, and pushed toward the creek. In a normal year, it drained away, forgotten. In a bad year, it cut. In 1982, a flood had sliced a gully through a neighbor's field, a wound so deep you could have buried a tractor in it, and nearly took out the old county road. Daniel had watched it happen. He had stood on that road with his neighbors, watching the water eat the earth, and he had made a promise to himself. After that, he started taking notes. He walked the field after every hard rain, mud sucking at his boots, rain dripping from his cap. He measured where water pooled. He dug shallow contour ditches by hand, and with an old blade. He left grass where other men would have disked it under. He was not trying to make the field pretty. He was trying to make it hold. Because Daniel Whitaker understood something that many farmers forget. You cannot fight water. You can only guide it. You cannot defeat it. You can only give it a place to go, a place to slow down, a place to lose its anger before it reaches something precious. But after Daniel was gone, people forgot why the field looked the way it did. Or maybe they never knew. Maybe it was easier to laugh than to ask questions. Maybe it was simpler to call it weeds than to wonder what a dead man had been thinking. The first public insult came on a Saturday morning in late February, the kind of gray Iowa morning when the sky hangs low and the cold seeps into your bones. Ellie and Martha drove into Harlan Junction in their old Ford pickup, a truck that had seen better decades. It coughed when it started, and rattled when it stopped. The seat had a tear patched with duct tape, but it ran, barely. They were there to buy chicken feed, fencing staples, and a small bag of clover seed, the same seed Ellie had been saving for, the same seed that would keep the bottom field covered one more season. The bell over the door at Harlan Feed and Seed rang when they walked in, a cheerful sound that did not match what was coming. 3 farmers stood near the counter drinking coffee from foam cups. Their conversations were the kind that filled small-town mornings. Weather, prices, who planted what, who sold what. Roy Pritchard was one of them. Roy was the kind of man people listened to because he owned enough acres to sound right even when he was wrong. He was not cruel every minute of the day. He paid his bills, usually on time. He helped at church auctions, when people were watching. He loaned equipment when it suited him, and reminded you of it later. But he believed small farms were dying because small farmers were too stubborn to admit it. He had said it 100 times. He would say it 100 more. He watched Martha set the clover seed on the counter and smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile that comes before words that will hurt. "More seed for that mess out back?" he asked. Martha kept her eyes down. She had learned, in the 2 years since Daniel died, that looking down was sometimes the safest thing to do. Ellie held the blue notebook under one arm, the same way her father used to hold it. Her knuckles were white. The feed store owner, Mr. Harlan, tried to change the subject. He was a decent man, one of the few who still asked Martha how she was holding up. "Spring's coming wet, they say," he offered, his voice too bright. Roy did not let it go. "Wet or dry, that field needs a plow." Daniel would have never let it look like that. The mention of her father's name in that tone, it was like a door slamming shut. Ellie's fingers tightened around the notebook. Martha said quietly, "Daniel planted that cover." Roy laughed. "Cover? Martha, that's not cover. That's weeds. And that girl's too young to know the difference." The silence in the store was heavy, the kind of silence where you can hear the fluorescent lights humming. Nobody in the store said anything. Not the farmers. Not Mr. Harlan. Nobody. Then Roy looked directly at Ellie, and there was something almost casual in the way he did it, as if wounding a child was just another part of his morning routine. "Your daddy knew how to farm. You're just letting his land embarrass his name." The words hit harder than Ellie expected. Not because they were loud. Roy did not raise his voice. Because they used her father against her. Because they took the thing she loved most and turned it into a weapon. Martha's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks like water from a sink. Mr. Harlan looked down at the counter, studying a scratch in the wood, as if it held the secrets of the universe. One of the farmers cleared his throat, but did not defend her. That was the worst part, not the insult, the silence that followed it. Ellie did not cry. She had learned, in the 2 years since her father died, that crying did not fix fences, or pay bills, or bring people back. She did not argue. She had learned that arguing with men like Roy was like arguing with the weather, useless and exhausting. She opened the blue notebook, looked at the page where her father had drawn the bottom field, his careful pencil lines showing the curve of the creek, the slope of the land, the places where water would go, then closed it again. Roy shook his head. A farm doesn't wait for a child to grow up. Ellie picked up the bag of clover seed. It was not heavy, maybe 5 pounds, but she carried it as if it weighed 50. Then she said the only words she would say that morning. Her voice was quiet, but in that quiet store, it carried. "It's not weeds." Roy smiled. That same smile, the one that said he knew everything, and she knew nothing. "Then what is it?" Ellie looked toward the rainy window. Outside, the world was gray and wet and cold. But somewhere, under the soil, roots were holding on. "Roots," she said. The men laughed then. All except Mr. Harlan. He watched Ellie carry the seed outside like it weighed more than 50 pounds. And he did not laugh. Because Mr. Harlan had known Daniel Whitaker, and he remembered the flood of 1982. And he wondered, just for a moment, if maybe, just maybe, the girl knew something the men had forgotten. By March, the talk had spread. That is the way of small towns. Words travel faster than weather. At church, women asked Martha if she had thought about renting the bottom field. They asked it sweetly, with tilted heads and concerned eyes. But the message underneath was clear. You cannot handle this alone. At school, one boy told Ellie his father said the Whitaker place looked like a farm after people gave up. He said it in the hallway, between classes, as if it were nothing, as if words could not wound. At the co-op, Roy said it would be kinder if Martha sold the bottom acres before the land lost value. "Kinder," he said, as if he were being generous. Then the county letter came. It was folded in a white envelope, stamped with the seal of the county weed commissioner, an official government envelope, the kind that rarely brings good news. Martha read it at the kitchen table after her shift at the diner. She was still in her uniform, her hair escaping from its ponytail, her hands smelling of dish soap. The kitchen light flickered. It had been doing that for months, and Daniel was not there to fix it. Ellie stood by the sink washing egg cartons, saving them, because they could be reused, because nothing on the Whitaker farm was thrown away if it could be saved. The letter said a complaint had been filed about uncontrolled vegetation along the road and fence line. The county would inspect the property in 2 weeks. If noxious weeds were found and not controlled, fines could follow. Martha sat down slowly, the way people sit when they have been carrying something too heavy for too long. "We can't pay a fine," she said. It was not a complaint. It was a fact, stated plainly. The way you might say, "It is raining," or "The sun has set." Ellie dried her hands on her jeans. "They're not all weeds. The county may not see it that way. I have the seed tags." Martha rubbed her eyes. She looked older in the kitchen light than Ellie remembered, the lines on her face deeper, the gray in her hair spreading like frost. "Honey, I know you love the way your father did things, but love does not pay taxes." The room went still. Ellie looked down at the floor, at the linoleum that was peeling at the edges, at the crack that had been there since she was a child. The sentence hurt because it was true. Love did not pay taxes. Love did not fix tractors. Love did not buy diesel, or shingles, or fencing wire. But Ellie also knew something else, something she could not quite put into words. Her father had not left that field covered because he was sentimental. He had not done it because he loved wildflowers, though he did. He had done it because he had learned something from the land, something the men at the feed store had never bothered to learn, something that was written in that blue notebook, waiting for someone to read it. That night, after Martha went to bed, her breathing slow and heavy with exhaustion, Ellie carried the blue notebook to the kitchen table. The house was quiet, except for the wind outside, and the occasional creak of old wood settling. She spread out her father's maps, hand-drawn on graph paper, the lines careful and precise. She spread out his rainfall records, columns of numbers in pencil, year after year, storm after storm. She spread out old seed receipts, the paper yellowed, the ink fading, and she spread out a photograph from 1982. The photo showed Daniel standing at the bottom field after the flood. He was young in that picture, younger than Ellie remembered him. He was not smiling. He was looking at something off camera, something serious. Behind him, the grass strip along the creek was bent flat, but still rooted. It had been pushed down by the water, but it had not been ripped away. It had held. Across the road, a neighbor's field had been carved open by moving water, a wound in the earth, raw and jagged. On the back of the photograph, in her father's handwriting, were 7 words. "The field saved the road once. Keep it covered." Ellie read the sentence 3 times. She traced the letters with her finger. The pencil strokes were faint now, but she could still feel the impression they had left on the paper. Then she turned to the page he had circled, the page that mattered most. "Never break the roots before flood season." She looked up from the notebook and stared out the dark kitchen window. The fields were invisible in the night, but she knew they were there. She knew the roots were there, holding on in the darkness, waiting. She did not know that a flood was coming. She did not know that in a few short weeks, every man in Miller Valley would see what her father had seen. She only knew that she had to hold on, just like the roots. Daniel Whitaker's blue notebook was not fancy. The cover was stained with oil, dark fingerprints from hands that had worked on engines and soil alike. The corners were soft, worn down by years of being carried in back pockets and coat pockets and left on tractor seats. Some pages had dirt pressed into the paper, the soil of the Whitaker farm, embedded into the very record of how to save it. But inside, Daniel had kept better records than most people expected from a man who rarely spoke at meetings. He was a quiet man, but quiet men often see the most. There were rainfall totals from 1979 to 1992, 13 years of watching the sky and measuring what fell. There were creek levels marked after spring storms, numbers written carefully, circled if they were dangerous. There were hand-drawn maps of the bottom field showing shallow curves where water naturally spread, the invisible paths that water had been following for centuries. There were notes about rye, clover, switchgrass, and willow roots. What held best? What grew deepest? What survived the longest? There were reminders written to himself in careful pencil. Do not disc low ground before April storms. Leave creek buffer until after first hay cutting. Bare soil moves fastest. Curve water. Never race it. Ellie did not understand every note. Some of the words were technical. Some of the drawings were complex. But she understood enough to know that her father had been preparing for something. He had been preparing for a day like this. A day when the rain would not stop and the creek would rise, and the land would be tested. So after school the next day, she rode her bike to the county extension office. It was a long ride, miles on a gravel road, the wind in her face, the blue notebook in her backpack. Her legs ached. She did not stop. The man behind the desk was young, maybe 28, with clean boots that had never seen a muddy field at dawn. He had a university sticker on his filing cabinet and a diploma on his wall. His name was Mr. Lowe. At first, he looked at Ellie like a girl carrying a notebook could not possibly have a serious question about soil. He had that look that educated people sometimes get, the look that says you do not belong here. "I'm not sure I can help you without your mother here," he said. Ellie opened the notebook and placed Daniel's flood map on the desk. She did it without speaking. Sometimes silence is the best argument. "I need to know if this makes sense." Mr. Lowe glanced at it, the way people glance at things they expect to dismiss. Then he looked again. He pulled the paper closer. His expression changed, the way a musician's face changes when they hear a chord they did not expect. "Who drew this?" "My dad." "When?" "After the 1982 flood." Mr. Lowe took a soil map from a metal cabinet, one of those official county maps with colored sections and fine print, and spread it beside Daniel's drawing. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just looked from one map to the other, back and forth. The lines were not identical, but they were close. The low strip in Daniel's notebook matched a band of silt loam marked on the county map. The slope ran toward the road ditch before curving back to the creek, exactly as Daniel had drawn it, years before the county had mapped it. Mr. Lowe tapped the paper. "This ground is vulnerable if it's bare during heavy rain." Ellie leaned forward. She felt something rise in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something close. "So, leaving cover on it helps?" "It can," he said carefully. "It does not stop a flood. Nothing stops a real flood. But roots can slow runoff. Grass buffers can trap sediment. Contour channels can spread water instead of letting it cut straight through." Ellie nodded. That was all she needed. Not a miracle. She was not asking for a miracle, just proof that her father had not been wrong, that he had not been foolish, that the field everyone called weeds was not a failure. It was a strategy. Before she left, Mr. Lowe wrote a note for the county inspector. He wrote it on official letterhead, his signature at the bottom. "Managed cover crop and conservation buffer present. Recommend review before enforcement action." Ellie folded the note and put it inside the blue notebook, next to her father's maps, next to his rainfall records, next to the photograph from 1982. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she had more than memory on her side. She had evidence. She had a grown-up who had looked at her father's work and said, "This makes sense." And she had the feeling, quiet but persistent, like roots in the dark, that her father was not finished teaching her yet. The county weed inspector came on a windy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of wind that makes flags snap and trees bend and people pull their collars tight. His name was Carl Bennett. He drove a white county pickup that had seen years of gravel roads, and wore boots that had seen enough mud to make Ellie trust him more than she expected. There are men whose boots tell you everything you need to know about them. Roy Pritchard happened to be waiting near the road when he arrived. He leaned against his truck like a man attending a show, arms crossed, a slight smile on his face. He had the look of someone who expected to be proven right. Martha came out of the house, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She had taken the afternoon off from the diner, lost wages, but some things mattered more than money. Ellie carried the blue notebook. She did not let go of it. Carl walked the edge of the field. He was thorough, the kind of thorough that comes from years of being yelled at by landowners who thought they knew better. He looked at the road ditch, the fence line, the creek buffer, and the thick green cover spreading across the bottom acres. "There are some problem plants along the fence," he said, his voice neutral. Ellie nodded. "I can pull those." Carl bent down and rubbed a leaf between his fingers, the way a man who knows plants tests them. "This is rye." "Yes, sir." "And clover." Yes, sir. He looked toward the creek. Switchgrass? My dad planted it after the 1982 flood. Roy gave a short laugh from his spot by the truck. It was not a loud laugh, just loud enough to be heard, just loud enough to remind everyone he was there, watching, judging. Carl looked at him. It was not a friendly look. Then he turned back to Ellie. Ellie opened the notebook. She showed him the seed tags, proof of purchase, proof of intention. She showed him Mr. Lowe's note, on official letterhead, the ink still fresh. She showed him the old map, her father's careful pencil lines. And she showed him the photograph from 1982, the field that held, the neighbor's field that didn't. Carl did not smile. He was not the kind of man who smiled easily. But his face changed. Something shifted behind his eyes. He walked farther into the field, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The soil was soft from recent rain, but it did not squelch. It held. He pulled up a small clump of rye and looked at the roots holding soil like a woven mat. For a long moment, he just stood there, a man in a field, holding a handful of roots. Then he said, "This field is not abandoned." Martha let out a breath. It was the kind of breath you take when you have been holding it for weeks without realizing. Roy pushed off his truck, his arms uncrossed. "You're telling me this mess passes inspection?" Carl looked at him. His voice did not rise. "I'm telling you I see managed cover, a creek buffer, and some weeds along the fence that need cleaning up. That is not the same thing as abandonment." Roy's jaw tightened. You could see the muscle working under the skin. Ellie said nothing. She had learned, from her father, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay quiet while the truth speaks for itself. Carl gave them 30 days to clean the fence line and suggested they keep documentation of the cover crop. He handed Martha a card with his office number. As he drove away, his white truck disappearing down the gravel road, Roy walked closer to Ellie. He stood over her, taller, older, richer, and shook his head. "Now the girl thinks weeds are engineering." Ellie looked up at him. She was not afraid. She had been afraid for so long that she had run out of fear. "They're roots," she said. Roy's smile faded. "Roots don't stop a flood." Ellie did not answer. She only looked past him toward Miller Creek, peaceful now, glittering in the afternoon sun. It did not look dangerous. It never did. But she knew. Her father had taught her. The danger does not announce itself. It just comes. By early April, the farm was still in trouble. The inspection had bought time. But time was not money. Time did not fill the propane tank, or patch the barn roof, or pay the property taxes that sat on the kitchen table like a ticking clock. Martha still had property taxes due. The envelope from the county was unopened, but she knew what was inside. She always knew. The farmall still would not start without coughing smoke. Black clouds that smelled of failure. A storm had pulled loose a strip of tin from the barn roof. Every time the wind blew, it rattled, a constant reminder of everything they could not afford to fix. And Roy Pritchard had made another offer for the bottom field. He came to the house one evening, not in the morning, when honest business was done, but in the evening, when people were tired and their defenses were low. He had papers folded inside his coat pocket. Ellie saw the corner of them sticking out. "I'm not here to insult you," he told Martha, standing on the porch with his hat in his hands. "I'm here to be practical." Ellie stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the porch. She did not move. Roy placed the offer on the table. The paper was clean and white and official looking. The number was not large, but to someone drowning, even a small raft looks like salvation. "I'll lease the bottom field this season. Fair price. I'll plow it, plant it, clean it up. You get money now, and the place stops looking neglected." Martha stared at the paper. Her hand rested on the table beside it. Not touching, just near. Ellie stepped forward. "You'll plow it before the rain." Roy looked at her. "That is generally how farming works. It's too early for that field." Roy gave a tired smile, the smile of a man who believed he had explained the obvious 100 times. "Ellie, your father is gone, and I am sorry for that. Truly I am. But a dead man's notebook cannot farm living ground." The words landed like stones in still water. Martha flinched. A small movement, but Ellie saw it. Ellie's face went still, not angry, not sad. Still, the way the surface of a pond goes still before a storm. She picked up the lease paper. She looked at the number. Then she placed it back on the table, gently, almost respectfully. Then she said, "Dad said the prettiest field in June can be the weakest field in April." Roy stood. He took his hat from the table. "I hope that sentence pays your taxes." After he left, his truck rumbling down the gravel drive, Martha sat in silence for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The wind rattled the loose tin on the barn roof. Finally, she pushed the paper away. 30 days, she said. Ellie looked at her. Martha's eyes were tired. The kind of tired that sleep cannot fix. But they were not empty. There was something still burning there, something that Roy Pritchard had not managed to extinguish. "I'll give your father's field 30 more days." Ellie nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. It was not a victory. It was a chance. And sometimes, a chance is enough. The rain started on April 14th. At first, it came soft and steady, the kind of rain that farmers welcome, that soaks into the soil and promises a good planting season. But by the second day, it was different. It was hammering the roof, a relentless drumbeat that made conversation impossible and sleep a distant memory. By the third day, the ditches were running full, and the radio in the kitchen repeated the same words every hour, as if saying them enough times would prepare people for what was coming. Flood watch, heavy rainfall, low-lying areas, Miller Creek. Martha was asleep after working the late shift, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. She did not hear the radio. She did not hear the rain intensifying. Ellie put on her father's old raincoat. It hung past her knees. She was still growing into it, still growing into him. She pulled the hood tight, tucked the blue notebook under the coat against her chest, and walked to the bottom field. The world was gray and wet and loud. The rain made rivers of the gravel drive. The sky was so low it seemed to touch the earth. The grass bent under the rain, but it did not break. The creek was high, higher than Ellie had ever seen it, but still inside its banks. Barely. It moved with a dark, muscular energy, like an animal testing its cage. Ellie checked the culvert first. Branches had gathered against the opening, debris from upstream, carried by water that was growing stronger by the hour. She dragged them away one by one, her hands cold and wet, her boots slipping twice in the mud. Then she walked the shallow contour ditch her father had cut years earlier. It was not deep. To most people, it looked like nothing more than a gentle curve in the field, barely noticeable, the kind of thing you would miss if you were not looking. But Ellie knew its purpose now. Do not race the water. Curve it. Slow it. Spread it. She cleared leaves from the low places. She tied a loose gate with wire, the same baling wire she had learned to use for everything. She checked the willow bank where the creek had undercut the soil. The willows were still holding, their roots deep and stubborn and alive. Before going back inside, she stood in the rain and looked across the field. It did not look strong. It looked small under the storm, a patch of grass and wildflowers against a sky that had turned against the world. For a moment, doubt crept into her chest. It was cold and sharp, the kind of doubt that comes in the middle of the night when everything seems impossible. What if Roy was right? What if roots were not enough? What if she had made her mother refuse the only offer that could have saved them from taxes? What if she was just a foolish girl clinging to a dead man's dream? Then lightning flashed, a white crack across the black sky, and she saw the old grass strip along the creek. It bent in the wind, but it held its place. It did not tear. It did not wash away. It bent, and it held. Ellie pressed her hand against the notebook under her coat. The cover was damp, but the pages inside were dry. Her father's words were still there, written in pencil, waiting. "Please be right, Dad," she whispered to the storm. "Please be right." At 5:40 the next morning, Miller Creek broke its banks upstream. It did not happen slowly. It happened all at once, the way a dam breaks, the way a bone snaps. One moment the water was contained, the next it was free. By 6:12, the siren sounded, a wail that cut through the rain and the wind and the gray dawn. By 6:30, water was crossing the low road. Roy Pritchard's east field had been worked the week before. He had plowed it early, because that was how he farmed. because he believed in clean ground and straight rows, and doing things the way they had always been done. The soil was bare, dark and smooth, as perfect as a painting. But when the water came down from the higher ground, it had nothing to slow it, nothing to hold it, nothing to stop it. It gathered speed across that bare field, faster and faster, like a thing with purpose. It cut small channels at first, little rivulets that looked harmless. Then those channels joined into larger ones. Then those larger ones became gullies. By the time the runoff reached the road ditch, it was carrying soil with it. Not a little soil. Sheets of it. The water looked like chocolate milk, thick with the top layer of a field that had taken decades, centuries, millennia to build. Roy stood beside his truck, staring. His truck, his field, his soil, running away from him in rivers of brown water. Other farmers arrived. Some came to help, because that is what farmers do when disaster strikes. Some came because disaster pulls people out of their homes, even when they cannot stop it. They stood in the rain with their hands in their pockets, watching the water erase their neighbor's work. The county road foreman, Jim Voss, parked his orange truck near the bend. He had 2 men with him and a small backhoe on a trailer. He was a practical man, Jim Voss, the kind of man who spoke in short sentences and did not waste time on panic. "The road's going to cut under," one worker shouted over the rain. Water was pushing toward the shoulder of County Road 6. It was eating at the gravel base, hungry, relentless. If it undercut the road, the whole thing could collapse. If the ditch clogged with mud and debris, water could push toward the grain elevator downstream, and if that happened, half the valley's harvest would be threatened. Jim looked across the Whitaker bottom field. His eyes were calculating, measuring, weighing options. "We may need to open a channel through there," he said. Roy pointed toward the overgrown field. His voice was sharp with fear and frustration. "Cut it straight. Get the water out fast." Ellie arrived just in time to hear him. She had run from the house in her yellow raincoat, her father's raincoat, boots splashing mud up her legs, the blue notebook under one arm. She was out of breath. Her hair was plastered to her face. She looked like a child who had been swimming in a storm. "No," she shouted. The men turned. Roy looked almost angry to see her, as if her presence were an inconvenience, a distraction from the serious business of saving the valley. "This is not the time, Ellie." She ran to Jim Voss. She did not stop. She did not hesitate. "Don't cut it straight. Follow the old ditch." Jim frowned. He was a man who trusted what he could see, and all he could see was water and mud and danger. "What old ditch?" Ellie opened the notebook with wet hands. The pages shook in the rain. Water dripped from her fingers onto the paper, but the pencil marks held. Her father's pencil marks, written years before this moment, still legible. She pointed to her father's map. "This curve, it spreads the water. If you cut straight, it'll tear through the field and take the bank with it." Roy barked out a laugh, a harsh, desperate sound in the rain. "Now we're taking flood advice from a schoolgirl?" Ellie did not look at him. She looked at Jim. "You knew my dad." Jim's expression changed. Something flickered behind his eyes. Daniel Whitaker had once pulled Jim's truck out of a washed-out ditch during the 1982 flood. Jim had never forgotten that. He had never forgotten the way Daniel had shown up. No questions, no payment, and spent 3 hours in freezing rain to save a neighbor's truck. Ellie held the notebook higher. The rain was smearing the pencil marks, but the map was still visible. The curve of the old ditch, the path the water should follow. He wrote it down after the last flood. The field saved the road once. Please don't cut it open. Rain ran off Jim's cap in silver streams. The workers waited. Roy said, "We're losing time." His voice was urgent now, almost desperate. Jim looked from the road to the field to the notebook. His jaw was tight. He was a man making a decision that would affect everyone in the valley. Then he said, "Show me the curve." They did not cut a straight channel. Jim Voss made his decision. He had the backhoe follow the shallow contour that Daniel Whitaker had marked years earlier. A line on a map, drawn in pencil, by a man who was no longer alive. The bucket cleaned out the old curve, just enough to guide water into the field without slicing a direct wound through it. It was a gamble. Everyone knew it. At first, nothing looked different. The floodwater came hard, a surge of brown power that seemed unstoppable. It poured into the bottom field with a force that made Ellie step back, her boots sinking into the mud. Ryegrass flattened under the weight of it. Clover disappeared under brown water, drowned, swallowed, hidden. The switchgrass along the creek bent nearly to the ground, as if bowing before something terrible. For one terrible minute, 60 seconds that felt like 60 years, Ellie thought she had been wrong. She thought of her father's notebook, her mother's tired eyes, the 30 days Martha had given the field. She thought of Roy's laughter, of the men at the feed store, of all the voices that had said, "You cannot do this." She thought, "I have failed. I have failed my father. I have failed the farm. I have failed everyone who ever believed in me." Then the water spread. Instead of carving one deep path, a wound that would bleed soil for years, it fanned across the covered soil. The grass slowed it. The stems bent but did not vanish. They were still there, still rooted, still holding. The roots held the topsoil in place like a million tiny fingers gripping the earth. The shallow curve carried part of the flow sideways, away from the road shoulder. The water lost its direction, its fury, its purpose. Mud began to drop out of the water in the low field, sediment settling, soil staying where it belonged, instead of racing toward the ditch. Jim Voss walked to the edge of the road and stared. His mouth opened slightly. He did not speak. One of his workers knelt and pushed a shovel into the edge of the Whitaker field. The soil came up heavy with roots, a thick, woven mat of life beneath the surface. Across the road, Roy's bare field was cutting. Thin brown streams had become small gullies. Small gullies were becoming larger ones. Soil poured into the ditch, soil that Roy's grandfather had farmed, soil that Roy's father had protected, soil that Roy himself had just lost. No one said that out loud. They did not need to. Everyone could see it. The county extension agent, Mr. Lowe, arrived in a muddy sedan just after 7. He had heard the road crew call over the radio. He had driven through rain and wind and rising water to get there. He walked straight to the field, bent down, and lifted a mat of rye roots from the edge of the water. The roots were intact, tangled with soil, dark with mud, but intact. Then he looked at Ellie. "Your father wrote this down?" Ellie nodded. She could not speak. Mr. Lowe looked across the field again, at the water that had spread instead of cut, at the soil that had stayed instead of fled. "It's holding sediment," he said. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "It's actually holding." Roy stood ankle-deep in muddy water beside his truck. His cap was soaked. His shoulders were hunched. His face had lost its confident look, the look of a man who always knew what to do. For months, he had called that field weeds. For months, he had laughed at a child. For months, he had insisted that clean ground was strong ground. Now those weeds, those stubborn, unappreciated, ridiculed plants, were slowing the water that his clean, perfect, prize-winning ground could not hold. Jim Voss took off his cap and wiped rain from his forehead. His hand was shaking, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was seeing. Then he said the words everyone heard. His voice carried across the rain. "That field is saving the road." No one laughed. No one said a word. The only sound was rain, water, and the low engine of the county backhoe. Ellie stood beside the field with the blue notebook pressed to her chest. Her father's raincoat hung heavy on her shoulders. Her hair was wet. Her boots were caked with mud. She did not smile. She only whispered, to herself, to her father, to anyone who might be listening. Bare soil runs. Rooted soil holds. By mid-morning, the worst of the surge had passed. The creek was still high, angry and swollen, the color of coffee with too much cream. It would take days to return to its banks. The road was still damaged, gravel washed away in patches, the shoulders soft and dangerous. The Whitaker field was full of water, branches, and brown sediment, a mess by any measure. Debris hung in the fence like laundry put out to dry and forgotten. It had not stopped the flood. Nothing could have stopped it. That much rain, that fast, on that slope, no field, no farm, no human effort could have held it all back. But the field had slowed the runoff enough to keep County Road 6 from washing out at the bend. It had trapped a heavy load of mud before it reached the drainage ditch. It had kept part of the flow from cutting straight toward the grain elevator road, the artery that connected the valley's harvest to the world beyond. That was enough. Sometimes a farm does not save a county by defeating nature. That is not how it works. Sometimes it saves a county by giving water a place to lose its anger, by being soft where others were hard, by bending where others broke. When the rain softened, from a roar to a whisper, from a flood to a shower, the men began to move. Jim and his crew checked the shoulder. They spoke in low voices, pointing at the places where the road had almost failed. Mr. Lowe took photographs, for his report, for the county, for the record. He kept looking at the Whitaker field, shaking his head slightly, as if he were seeing something he had read about in textbooks, but never witnessed with his own eyes. The sheriff radioed that the road was damaged but still passable for emergency vehicles. "We got lucky," he said into the radio. Jim Voss looked at Ellie and did not correct him, but his expression said everything. Martha arrived in her diner shoes. She had run from the house, her coat thrown over her uniform, her hair wild from the wind. Her eyes were wide with fear, the fear of a mother who had woken to find her child gone in the middle of a flood. She saw Ellie standing near the field, soaked but safe, small and wet and alive. Then she saw the men. No one was laughing. No one was smirking. No one was calling the field a weed patch. Roy Pritchard stood apart from the others. He had moved away from the group, isolating himself the way wounded animals do. He looked across his own field, where small gullies now cut through the clean black soil, like scars on a handsome face. Then he looked at the Whitaker bottom ground, rough and flooded and messy, but still there, still intact, still whole. For a long time he said nothing. The rain dripped from the brim of his cap. Finally he walked toward Ellie and Martha. His boots made sucking sounds in the mud. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to show that he knew he did not belong in their space. He looked at the blue notebook, still clutched against Ellie's chest, the cover dark with rain. "Your father knew that ground," he said. It was not a full apology. Roy Pritchard was not the kind of man who knew how to apologize. It was not warm, it was not generous. But for Roy Pritchard, in front of half the valley, it was as close as pride would allow. Ellie looked at the flooded field, her father's field, her field, the field that had held. "He listened to it," she said. Roy nodded once, a small, stiff movement. Then he walked back to his truck. His shoulders were still straight, but something had changed. Something had bent in him that had never bent before. The men from the feed store were there, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had stayed silent while Roy insulted a child. They did not come over. They did not apologize. But they looked at Ellie differently now, with something that might have been respect, or might have been shame, or might have been both. The flood did not make the Whitakers rich. That is not how these stories work in real life. Real life does not hand out rewards like fairy tales. It did not fix the barn roof. The tin still rattled when the wind blew. It did not start the farmall. The old tractor sat under its tarp, patient and silent. It did not pay the property taxes waiting on the kitchen table, the envelope still unopened, the deadline still approaching. By the next week, the bottom field smelled of wet grass and silt, that earthy, musty smell that follows floods. Branches were tangled in the fence, gifts from upstream, delivered by the water. One corner near the creek had slumped and needed repair. The old gate was ruined, twisted by the force of the current. There was mud in places Ellie had never seen mud before, on the fence posts, in the grass, caked on the bark of trees. But the field was still there. The topsoil was still there, not washed downstream, not filling the road ditch, not choking the creek. Still on the Whitaker farm, where it belonged. The road was still there, passable, functional, saved. And in Miller Valley, the way people talked about the Whitaker place began to change. Not overnight. Change does not happen overnight in small towns. But it began. Mr. Lowe filed a report with the county extension office. He did not make it dramatic. He did not call Ellie a hero, though perhaps he should have. He simply wrote that the cover crop, grass buffer, and old contour channel had reduced sediment flow and helped protect the road ditch during the April flood. But people read the report. and people talked. Carl Bennett, the weed inspector, came back and walked the field again. The sky was clear this time, a pale April blue. His boots were dry. "This needs cleanup," he said, pointing at the debris along the fence. Ellie nodded. "I know. I'll do it." Then Carl looked toward the creek buffer, the switchgrass standing tall again, recovering from its bending, doing its quiet work. "But don't tear that out." Martha let out a small laugh, the kind that comes from exhaustion more than joy. But there was joy in it too, somewhere underneath. "No, sir," she said. "We won't." A week later, Roy Pritchard walked into Harlan Feed and Seed. The bell over the door rang, the same cheerful sound it had made that cold February morning. Ellie was there, buying fencing staples, with coins and small bills from a coffee can. The egg money jar, still serving the farm. The store went quiet when Roy entered. Conversations paused. Coffee cups were lowered. He picked up a bag of rye seed, then another, then clover. The bags were heavy, but he carried them himself. He set them on the counter with a solid thump. Mr. Harlan raised an eyebrow. "These for you?" Roy looked at Ellie, then at the seed. "Put those on my account," he said. His voice was gruff, but there was something different underneath it. Mr. Harlan asked, "For your south field?" He knew the answer. Everyone knew the answer. Roy took off his cap. He held it in his hands, the way men do at funerals, at church, at moments that matter. "Bottom ground," he said. No one teased him. No one needed to. The room was silent, but it was a different silence than the one that had filled the store in February. That silence had been cruel. This silence was respectful. Before leaving, Roy paused beside Ellie. He did not look at her directly. He looked at the seed, at the floor, at the door. "That field of yours," he said. "It made a fool out of me." The words hung in the air. Ellie did not answer right away. She thought of her father, how he would have handled this moment. He would not have gloated. He would not have demanded an apology. He would have been gracious. Then she said, "The flood did that." For the first time, the very first time, Roy almost smiled. It was not the confident smirk he had worn for months. It was something smaller, something more human. "Fair enough," he said. Then he walked out, the bell ringing behind him, and Ellie was left standing at the counter with her coffee can of coins. By June, the Whitaker bottom field was green again. Not wild the way it had looked in March, when the rye was ragged and the clover was uneven, and the men at the feed store had called it a disgrace. Managed, mowed where it needed mowing, the fence line clean, the problem plants gone. Thick along the creek, the switchgrass standing tall like a wall of green soldiers, the willow saplings reaching higher toward the sun. Cleaned along the fence, no debris, no branches, no reminders of the flood, except the memory. The wildflowers returned in the corners, purple and white and yellow, scattered like confetti, unplanted but welcome. The clover bloomed low and white, a carpet of small blossoms. The rye was cut and left as mulch, feeding the soil it had protected. The switchgrass stood like a wall where the water had bent it flat but failed to pull it loose. With help from the county extension office, Martha applied for a conservation program that helped pay for maintaining the creek buffer. It was not much money, a few $100s, barely enough to notice. But it was enough to buy fencing material and cover part of the tax bill. Enough to keep going, enough to hold on. Ellie kept going to school. She kept feeding chickens. She kept repairing what the flood had damaged, one fence post at a time, one gate latch at a time, one day at a time. She was still 13. She was still small. She still wore her father's raincoat when the weather turned bad, the sleeves still too long, the shoulders still too wide. But people stopped calling the bottom field a weed patch. They stopped calling it a disgrace. They stopped using her father's name as an insult. One afternoon, a warm June day, the kind that makes Iowa feel like the most beautiful place on earth, Jim Voss and the road crew placed a small marker near the bend in County Road 6. It was not fancy, just a metal sign on 2 posts. Green letters on white metal. Whitaker Conservation Buffer. Ellie stood beside her mother and looked at it. The sign caught the afternoon sun. Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Your dad would have liked that," she said. Ellie shook her head, a small, sad, knowing smile on her face. He would have said the sign was too much. Martha laughed, a real laugh this time, full and warm. Yes, she said. He would have. He absolutely would have. Across the road, Roy Pritchard was drilling cover crop into one of his lower fields for the first time in his life. The tractor moved slowly across the ground, not plowing, not cutting, just planting roots. He did not wave. That was not who Roy was. But he did not look away either. And for Roy Pritchard, that was something. Years later, people in Harlan Junction would still talk about the April flood. They would talk about it at the diner, over coffee and pie. They would talk about it at the feed store, leaning against the counter. They would talk about it at church, in the parking lot after the service. They would talk about the road that almost washed out. They would talk about the brown water coming down Miller Valley, how it looked like chocolate milk, how it sounded like thunder. They would talk about Roy Pritchard standing in the rain without a word to say, the richest farmer in the valley, speechless for the first time in his life. But most of all, they would talk about the Whitaker girl in the field everyone mocked. They would say she was stubborn, and they would smile when they said it, because stubbornness is a virtue in farm country. They would say she was lucky, and some of them would believe it, because luck is easier to understand than wisdom. They would say she had her father's patience, and that was the truest thing any of them ever said. Ellie never corrected them. She knew it was not luck. Luck does not plant rye in the fall. Luck does not save egg money for clover seed. Luck does not read an old notebook and trust what it says. And it was not stubbornness alone. It was a notebook, worn and stained, filled with pencil marks and careful drawings. It was a promise, made by a daughter to a father, to keep the field covered, to trust the roots, to listen before breaking the ground. It was a field kept covered when everyone said to make it clean. A field that looked weak but was strong, that looked messy but was wise. It was a child who did not know everything, who was scared, who doubted, who nearly gave up, but knew enough to check the map before breaking the ground. And it was a father who had taught her, in his quiet way, that land does not always speak loudly. Sometimes it speaks in slope, the gentle curve that guides water instead of fighting it. Sometimes it speaks in roots, the million tiny fingers holding the earth together. Sometimes it speaks in watermarks, the lines on trees and banks that say, this is where the flood reached before, and this is where it will reach again. Sometimes it speaks in old scars, the wounds left by storms people would rather forget, but should not. The men at the feed store had once laughed because Ellie Whitaker would not plow. They thought an overgrown field meant failure. They thought clean ground meant strength. They thought they knew what a farm should look like. Then the flood came, and the field they called weeds held together while the fields they praised began to run. Bleeding soil, bleeding history, bleeding generations of work into the brown water. That was the day Miller Valley learned a lesson Daniel Whitaker had written down years before, in pencil, in a notebook nobody bothered to read until it was almost too late. A farm is not always saved by the biggest tractor, or the straightest rows, or the loudest man at the feed store. Sometimes it is saved by a quiet girl, an old notebook, and roots nobody respected until the water came. Some people only see weeds because they have forgotten how roots work. Ellie Whitaker did not save her father's farm by arguing louder than the men who mocked her. She did not save it by being stronger, or richer, or older, or more powerful. She had none of those things. She saved it by listening to the ground, the way her father had taught her. She saved it by trusting what her father left behind. Not money, not equipment, but knowledge, written in pencil, waiting to be remembered. She saved it by waiting for the day the rain would prove him right. And when that day came, when the sky opened and the creek rose, and the valley held its breath, the roots held, and the men who had laughed went silent, not because they were defeated, because they finally understood. The strongest thing in a storm is not always the tallest tree, or the deepest foundation, or the heaviest stone. Sometimes, the strongest thing in a storm is a field of grass that knows how to bend.